Hi, Jill. How are you?
Hi, I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, good. Thanks very much. I think leadership is becoming one of the core topics of the moment. Obviously, you're doing a lot of work in this field. Um, Obviously, a number of companies are getting quite a lot of criticism about how they're acting at the moment. What are your views? Because leaders are facing quite a challenge, aren't they, at the moment? They're having to adapt to the marketplace, which is going to be quite severe, I think it's fair to say. But at the same time, engage their teams and keep them motivated in a time when they're obviously a lot of them are away on furlough. How do you view this whole picture at the moment?
So I think leadership is the thing that's going to separate the wheat from the chaff in many respects. I think leaders are clearly busier than ever. They are having to pivot their businesses to serve the consumer in new and different ways. And one thing that's, if we start on a positive note, there's a real kind of shift towards internal processes and systems being probably more efficient than they've ever been. But what is taking a real hit is the tasks that are requiring a bit more creativity, a little bit more engagement and collaboration from their people. And so that's what I thought I might focus on today, because I've seen so many leadership hacks, in a sense, during COVID-19. Lots of the big consultancies coming out with, 10 ways to engage your people at this time. I was reading something this morning. Here's one, 10 enduring lessons for turbulent times. Number one, communicate, then communicate some more. Create order from chaos, exude realistic optimism, demonstrate grit. Now, no one can argue with that, of course. But what my issue is with all of that is that when done badly, it can do more harm than good. And really what we're talking about here is a leader's ability to pivot themselves, pivot their own ability to lead during this time. That's what I think savvy leaders are doing. They are using this period to really reflect on their own leadership practice. And there are no shortcuts to that.
Do you think they are reflecting?
I think that there's a combination of rabbits and headlights. But as we realize that we're in this for the long run, I think some leaders are being forced to recognize that the buck stops with them in terms of how they set the tone for this new way of working. So what I'm particularly interested in, and have been for some time, but this is heightening it, is this notion of the uncertain leader being king. Not only one who thrives on uncertainty, but actually seeks it out as a way of generating a competitive advantage. I'm interested in working with organizations that want to put learning at the center of their business strategy as the only way to sustain high performance, really, in this kind of uncertain time and leave a meaningful legacy. And finally, prioritizing diversity as a way to break down barriers and create a fair and equitable kind of working environment where all voices are heard. So with that in mind, I think, boiling it down, we've got a short amount of time here today, but I think there are three things that leaders that stick out for me that leaders really need to be focusing on. The first is, and I'll tackle them in a bit more detail, but the first is letting go of knowing and being right. The second is prioritizing learning, as I said, as a way of adapting to change. And third is having the courage to work at depth. So if it's okay with you, Chris, maybe I'll just say a little bit more about what I mean by those three things.
Okay, for it.
So one of the things I love about leadership is that it's full of paradoxes. And one of them is this notion of knowing versus uncertainty. So often leaders believe that the higher they go in the organization, the more they need to know. But that knowing can often get in the way. The more a leader gets comfortable with knowing, with not knowing, the better equipped they are for modern leadership. And the problem that we have with this is that we have almost a kind of God-given human need to look good and be right. And I think that really gets in the way of a leader's ability to see beyond what's immediately in front of their nose. In a sense, we've all been educated. We're hardwired to look for answer, which necessarily limits our viewpoint to finding the answer, as opposed to looking outwards for possibility. It's doubly hard for leaders, of course, because the need to know is often projected onto them by their people. And this is a great example of that, where there's so much uncertainty and anxiety. Leaders feel that they are being looked to for the answers, for certainty. We see that in ourselves, looking, at 4:30 when we tune into the news, we're looking for answers. We need to know. So the pressure on leaders at this time is immense. I get it. But the reality is, I haven't met a leader who isn't uncertain, who doesn't live with uncertainty. Underneath all the education, all the knowledge, we're hardwired for uncertainty. All we need to do is tune into that little whispering voice in our heads that plagues us every day about the incessant whispering. Underneath all that uncertainty is fear, in a sense. And
can I just ask a quick question on that point? Because one of the things you see, the dynamics you see at the moment, is that some leaders having a desire for control, which ties into what you're saying. It's all about control, but actually this is a period you can't control. So isn't part of the challenge they're facing at this point is the fact you have this battle between the need to control and not being able to control, which will get worse with everyone working away from the office as well.
And this is exactly why I'm saying that savvy leaders are pivoting exactly on this paradox, because we're not going to know. And the more we try to grasp back control, the less authentic we become, because everyone knows that no one really knows. So my sense of this is that we have to start prioritizing leadership as learning. And the minute that the leader starts to let go of their need to look good and be right, they put themselves into the position of being open to learning. They actually become a beginner again. Their listening becomes more acute. They are much more curious. They are essentially stripping away all that was for the possibility of what could be. And they're also then role modeling to their organization, to their team, that's okay. So essentially, when we create that kind of reflective practice as a culture within an organization, we're kind of saying that it's okay to sit in the question and allow the answer to emerge rather than to be engineered. And I think that the leaders that will really come out of this on top are the ones that are really able to demonstrate that sense of vulnerability to their people, that it's okay not to know. We can sit in here together and allow the answer to emerge. It's a very, very different approach to change. It's certainly not one that has been held up on high in days gone by with Gantt charts and spreadsheets and targets. It's one that requires a lot more stillness, actually. Leaders who are comfortable to go slower, to be present, to be really acutely aware with all of their senses, what's actually going on, what's in the field, what's wanting to emerge, it's a strange question, I granted, but what is trying to happen here? And therefore, when I speak to leaders about this, cognitively they get it. But the problem is that leaders will say to me, but it's a luxury because we don't have time for that. There's no time for stillness. There's no time for, you're talking, Jill, about, me meditating twice a day. There's no time for that. And what I say to that is leaders who prioritize learning as a strategy get really, really good personally at delegating every single part of their role that is not people orientated. And I know that's controversial, but really, I think another paradox in leadership is this notion that partly your role as a leader is to make your role redundant. So redundancy is a big theme in my work. I feel that redundancy is an issue with redundancy with a capital R, i.e. moving towards the end of a career, but also redundancy in terms of feeling that my identity, my role is not mine anymore. There's a kind of real sense of, oh, well, what am I useful for? What am I good for? And actually, I'd love for leaders to get comfortable with this notion that your job is to make your role redundant and make your being rather than your doing the priority. So how you show up, how you are able to have conversations that move people and situations forward, conversations that generate ideas, that are expansive rather than reductionist. And an example I'll give you is one you mentioned, which is leaders, in a sense, almost reverting to type at the moment and focusing on micromanaging, checking up on, almost a kind of reversal to presenteeism, which we were making great headway into getting rid of. I see in pockets almost coming back in this new virtual world where leaders are feeling nervous about what's everyone doing? And I get it, I really get it, but it does require an entire organization to kind of shift to this new way of working because we're not going back. So delegating really effectively requires the ability to have very, very powerful, meaningful conversations, and not just meaningful conversations face to face with a warm body and a warm body, but we need to get better at actually reading the room over a two-dimensional screen too. I mentioned in that article that I picked up, communicate. Well, for me, communication is about real conversations. The good news is that COVID, I think, is actually removing a lot of the artifice that we tend to put on. I mean, here I am sitting with my hot water bottle and a blanket beneath the headshot, and I'm sitting here with a cat on the bed over there, and a dog that any moment might come in and throw everything up in the air. We're actually connecting with our own authenticity, which I think is a great thing. But we need to be able to have real conversations from that place. So it starts with the leader connecting with their own sense of vulnerability, their own, what does it mean to be authentic in my body? Because it's different for every person.
Isn't one of the issues here that there's a whole re-education? Because I agree with you. I think leadership has changed. Because I was talking to someone the other day and they were saying, there's X amount of leadership styles, and everyone still talks through the old stereotypical leadership styles. But actually, to me, that's all gone out the window, because the world's been so transparent. It is all about how you learn and constantly adapt every day, because actually you're always being watched or seen, and it makes it much harder for people, I think, than ever before. Is that fair?
It is, and there's a pressure that comes with that notion of, I can almost feel a tightening in my stomach, that idea of being watched and being seen, being observed. That has been really heightened in the last few weeks with the being on Zoom calls where every face is potentially being scrutinized and you don't know who's watching you. It's uncomfortable, and yet we have to get comfortable with the discomfort, and we have to. You're right. I think that the leadership ways of old have literally died a death overnight. And, when I started out as a strategy consultant for Accenture, one of the things that consultants get really good at very quickly is this notion of looking under the skin of a problem to what's really going on. So that's how we're kind of trained is never believe what the client's asking you to come in to solve, because usually you're blind to your blindness. You can't see what's really going on. So if nothing else, being able to have real conversations to discern what's really going on is vitally important. If we're not able to really look beneath the words and and kind of have use our senses, use our intuition, use our feeling to get a notion of what's real, then we might be solving the wrong problem.
Yeah, look, I buy that. The problem is, isn't it, is that arguably all the stats say that actually we haven't been very successful in that in the last 5 years.
No.
If you look at the lack of trust in leaders, which has grown and grown and grown, and mainly I think because they're not seen as being genuine and authentic, you can correct me if you think I'm wrong, and the messaging is not genuine and authentic, and also the amount of disengaged employees, because actually one of the pieces of feedback we get constantly is how many people on furlough have decided they just really have no real desire to go back to life as it was before. And actually they discovered a whole new lifestyle, which has been protected by furlough and actually but created a bubble that's not quite real. So we have on one hand this dynamic, old school dynamic, which is all about control and getting back to business and economics, which is undoubtedly going to be needed. And over here we have a protected bubble where people want to see change and something very different. And how we bridge that is going to be a real challenge, isn't it?
Mm. Well, people have had a glimpse into a life worth living, and this notion of what really matters to me when all is stripped away. How do I want to spend my time? What do I love? You know, love isn't a word that's used very often in business, and yet kind of we've been thrown into this place of we're spending more time with the people we love. We're spending more time doing the things we love. We're spending more time in nature for those of us who are lucky to do so. And I think you use the word trust. It is pivotal to a leader's role right now. But again, it starts with, first of all, trust in self. Trust that, do I trust myself to lead in uncertainty? And if not, then find a good coach and do the work to get there, because it's only from that place that you can instill and engender the trust that is needed to engage others. Now, young people young people want to work, but they want to work in a way that enhances their life, that doesn't reduce it in any way. That there's and that requires, we talk about psychological safety. It requires genuine safety to be able to speak my voice, to be able to use my voice to influence, not to feel like I have to bend into a different shape, because ultimately it just feels too uncomfortable. And, you know, many of us who've been in the workplace for a while know that feeling that, you know, you put up with it, but it has to go somewhere, and eventually it leaks out. I think younger people are realizing that a lot sooner and voting with their feet.
Oh, look, I think actually they're an exciting generation coming through.
Hugely, and yet there is a real place for eldership, and you know, older leaders have a choice to grow old or to become an elder, and we need elders. It's not something that we have prioritized in our culture. I think the East does this much better, but I would love to see leaders at the latter stages of their career really taking a new role within an organization to become the Sherpas for the next generation. But that requires humility. It requires letting go of the ground that they've stood on for so long, and being willing to stand in the shoes of another, being willing to learn. The race riots in America are a great example of this, of being able to stand in another's shoes genuinely and say, I don't know, but I'm willing to learn, and I'm willing to listen, and I'm willing to work at depth, because depth takes discomfort. And are leaders willing to stand in their own discomfort in order to learn something new, and in order to create organizations that are sustainable and that leave a legacy beyond them? That's, I think, what employees are looking for, certainly the new generation, but it's also what consumers are looking for, because consumers can smell a rat a mile off.
Well, it goes back to your quoting the article earlier, isn't it? People are tired of cliches. And actually they need something. They don't mind if it's raw or not, just something real. They don't want polished, because actually everyone at the moment I find has got an opinion. I'm sure we have. But everyone seems to be an expert in everything, have an opinion, but also polishing up the brand. But actually, that's not what people want to listen to.
Yeah.
What people want to listen to is something very real. And
yeah. Well, I mean, let's be clear. I think experts have come out on top in many respects during COVID. And my goodness, how grateful we are to them, be it the NHS or the brave scientists that stand up day in, day out in front of us to tell us the stats. We are reliant on that. I am not saying for 1 minute that knowledge is not key, but I think it comes, it sits alongside the ability to be open to other, and to be orientated towards other as opposed to our own self-interest. And that is what consumers look for. I mean, the rise of reality TV in the last, 20 years, it is no coincidence, because the winners are the ones that we believe, regardless of what they believe in. They're congruous. They're the ones that we look in and we get. There's no hidden agenda. There's no, we're not left waiting. And I think organizations are no different to reality TV shows. We want to know that what they're saying to us is real. And employees will tell us, because social media now is open to all. We know what goes on inside organizations, and leaders who think that we don't are fools. So I think this notion of being able to learn afresh, and the excitement that comes with that. I mean, I think it's a great time to be a leader, because we all get to start with a blank canvas. We all get to reinvent ourselves in a way. And that doesn't come without discomfort. But one of the reasons I'm so excited about my profession's role in this is that we've been working in this way for years, over Zoom and remotely, because we're sensing, we're good at kind of reaching beyond the screen and smelling a rat and saying, I don't buy that. That's bullshit.
Yeah, well,
tell me what's really going on.
Absolutely. So does HR have to change the way it actually goes about things? Because HR has been quite an area of high criticism over the years, hasn't it?
It has, and I have lots of colleagues in HR, so I feel for them, because I think their role has, in a sense, become more transactional, ironically, in the last few years. I would love to see a revolution in HR, where HR become the champions for this kind of working. And they are so close, they could be very close to businesses and could call it out if they have the courage to work at depth. But HR is going to have to go through a major revolution, because in my experience, there's a lot of looking good and being right there, as there is
in all disciplines. In
all systems, of course there is, but it requires us all to kind of take a step back and have a really hard look. There's no, I said at the beginning, there's no shortcuts. You have to do the work. We have to start with ourselves and work out, how did I become the leader, the learner, the person that I am today? What has made me feel the need to control? What has made me feel the need to be liked? We all have our thing. And when we can take a good look, it just allows us to be free from some of the things that have held us back. And I don't know anyone who doesn't want that feeling of freedom from the shackles.
But I think that's quite a new concept, isn't it? I mean, that's part of what I'm conscious of our time. But in the old days, the old saying that mortgages made mighty men. People actually knew they had to give up freedom to get through life and make savings and pensions. Now, actually, people have an expectation of freedom. That's a big change, social change, isn't it?
It's a huge social change, and I recognise. I mean, we could have another conversation about the word freedom alone for the next hour. I think the one thing I will say about freedom is that it starts with understanding how we have put ourselves in a cage, how we have entrapped ourselves. because if we can realize that we can open the door and walk out, we're not confined to our learned behavior, to our inherited values and beliefs, to experiences that have shaped us for good and for bad. We can adapt, and we should adapt, and it's right to adapt, and it's exciting to adapt. If we can, it starts there. But if we don't recognize that those are the leaders we need, we will not create organizations that thrive and sustain and are for our planet, rather than inadvertently, albeit against it. And I recognize it is difficult. It is confronting. You know, I could have come on this call and given you a regurgitation of everything that we've heard before. I could have said communicate, and a whole list of top 10 tips for how to communicate during COVID-19. But the reality is, I'm bored of that. It doesn't cut it.
Well, it's just not you.
And you know, I recognize that there will be some people who look in and say, well, that's all very idealistic and a little bit maybe new age. And I'm 100% prepared to be challenged on that. But I am trying to look at myself in a way that thinks, how am I standing in my way? How am I standing in my way to a path to freedom and happiness? But equally, how am I standing in my way to my own people, to the people who look up to me?
I think that's right, Jill. But I think the point I'm trying to make is actually we've gone through a major social change, haven't we? Yeah. And actually, the way young people are thinking now, I think that's what I'm trying to get to. I think a lot of my generation have to actually learn that actually young people think very, very differently now. And their expectations are very, very different. And as companies, like it or not, it's one thing saying you've got to do this and do this, but actually you've also got to engage on a higher plane than probably was the case before.
I agree, Chris, but I don't, in a sense, we could talk about, you know, emerging leaders and exiting leaders. We're all people. I think ultimately we're not that different.
I agree.
I suspect, and I know this partly because I spend a lot of my time one-to-one with CEOs, CFOs, executive directors who are behind in the trust, the confidentiality of the coaching four walls, will admit to the very same things that their children are asking for. There's coming a new wave where they're saying, actually, do you know what is this all for? Where am I going to get my sense of worth and identity from when my name is no longer attached to a role? I think it's an age of real possibility for a generation that has been potentially duped into thinking a certain way, when actually deep down, we're all human beings. We all have intrinsic needs, and we know what we love deep down, but it sometimes takes a bit of uncovering. So my invitation to all, young, old, you know, wherever you live, is to use this period to have a good look, to take a look, to be curious, to have the courage to go deeper, and not to sell out and think it's too late, for example, but to be willing to step into a more interesting, meaningful, purposeful conversation about what you're here for and what would make a life worth living.
Jill, on that note, I'm going to say thank you to you. That was brilliant, really. I could talk to you for another 3 hours, I reckon. So sure, look, thank you so much for that. That's really kind.
You're very welcome. Thanks so much. Take care.
And you, take care.